We're looking now at the second part of the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate. You'll recall that this trial falls into two halves, and Jesus is brought before Pilate and is arraigned before him, and Pilate does his very best to dispense with the trial and to let Jesus off. But he's unsuccessful in that. He then sends Jesus off, therefore, to Herod in order for him to take responsibility, because above all else, Pilate is trying to avoid the responsibility of condemning an innocent man, as he respects. Herod sends him back, and the second half now is picked up in John chapter 19. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, O King of the Jews!" And they struck him on the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you, sir, to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." And when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. And when he went back inside the palace, "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize that I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" And Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. And therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat in a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of the preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. The thing which strikes you most forcefully in this discourse, or to me at any rate, is the extraordinary lengths that Pilate goes to in order to not have Jesus crucified. He does absolutely everything in his power. If you go back to John chapter 18, Pilate in verse 29 asked what charges they want to bring against him, and as if to say, "I'm not just going to go along with the ride and just do what you say. You have to make your case. I want you to make the case." And 31, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." And Pilate went back inside and he said, "You are a king then? You're right in saying I'm a king. This I come to the world. What is truth?" He goes back out to the people. "Do you want me to release Barabbas instead?" And they say no. Release Jesus instead of Barabbas, but no, they say give us Barabbas. So he tries, first of all, to say no, I find him innocent. No, I find him innocent. Then he says, let's give him an opportunity to release him instead of they choose Barabbas. So he That failed as well. He then sends him off to Herod, hoping that he would take responsibility, but that doesn't work. It comes back to Pontius Pilate. Then Pilate, it says, has Jesus flogged, and the soldiers twist a crown of thorns and put it on his head because he's king of the Jews. The reason I think he had him flogged is interesting. I think that is merely to appease the crowd, because he felt, this is my guesswork here, that by having Jesus flogged, that would be enough. That would assuage their thirst for blood, that would be all that they would require. He could see that he's been treated in a harsh way, he's been beaten and he's been flogged. That will be enough for them. They will no longer want any more. I've gone some way to satisfying their demands. That, it seems to me, is the reason why. Not because he felt he deserved it, but because it was another way of getting out of having him crucified. But once more, he comes out and says to the Jews, look, I'm bringing him out to you. I find no basis of a charge, he says. Again, this must be the third or fourth time now that he said, I find no basis of any charge against Jesus. And then, but because they scream still for his crucifixion, goes back in, looks at him, and says, once more, Pilate came to the Jews, look, I'm bringing him out to you, there is no charge. As soon as they saw him, they say, crucify him, crucify him. But Pilate answered, you take him and crucify him yourself. I find no basis of a charge. Now that would normally be the end of the matter. That would be Pilate saying, I'm done with this. I've finished with this matter. But here, it's not the end, because so incensed are the crowd and so determined are they that Jesus must be crucified, they come back again and again. You take him and crucify him, they say. He says, I find no basis of a charge. But they say, we have a law. He claimed to be the Son of God. He deserves to die. We can't kill him or put him to death ourselves. You must do it. It says Pilate was even more afraid. What does that mean? He was even more afraid when they said he claims to be the Son of God. There's a couple of things you can say about that. One is that by claiming to be the Son of God, he knew this is a kind of divine title. Only the emperor claims to be divine, the Son of Gods. And in that sense, you might see someone here who seeks to usurp the role or put himself on the same level as the emperor, which no one would do. And that might have caused his fear that this is a serious matter. I've got to deal with this and sort it out. But there's this other possibility too, that Pilate sees something in Jesus which he hasn't seen in anybody else. And his claim to divinity, being the Son of God, only backs up what he already sees in Jesus. There's no doubt that Pilate is afraid. You might even say terrified of the chance of Jesus being crucified under his watch. He does not want, under any circumstances, to be held responsible for this man's death. He understands him to be innocent. He understands him to have no charge against him. He understands that this is a person who is of special quality. And being someone who claims to be the Son of God, well, that might cause fear in and of itself as to who this person actually is. He goes back and asks Jesus, where do you come from? Now that's a telling question, because that means there's doubt in Jesus' mind as to not that he comes from Judea, but do you come from God? This is a question which Pilate is seriously entertaining, it seems to me, because of that question, where do you come from? And it's just an unusual question to ask of any person who's a Jew in Israel, because the answer is, I come from Israel, you know. And Jesus gives him no answer. a kind of contemptuous response, as Jesus has not been involved in this process, not seeking to defend himself. He's under no illusions that where this is going, and there therefore is no need to defend himself, or no approach. There is no way in which Jesus is bargaining for his life. He gives him no answer because he knows that the end result of this process must be his crucifixion, and there is no way out from that. He's known that not just in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's known that from the very first start, from the beginning of his ministry, where he said at the wedding at Canaan, "My time has not yet come." Well, here, his time has come, and he knows that's the case. "Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you? Why are you refusing to speak to me?" says Pilate. Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." That underlines the idea that he is the Son of God. God himself is the one who is above, and you would have no power over me unless God himself has given you that power. That's an interesting response, because that's replying to what Pilate has asked, "Where do you come from?" And it's from above. Right from the beginning of John's Gospel. Remember, the motif which explains almost every passage in John is, in the beginning was the Word, Jesus, and the Word was with God in heaven and was God, divine in nature. And therefore, you would not have any power if it were not given to you from above. All this is ordained from higher authority and power than you have any conception of, is what's behind that statement. "And therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." That word "therefore" is interesting. You could only do what you are meant to do. And the person here that you are playing, the role that you're playing, has already been ordained. You don't have any power to do anything other than what has been granted by God. "But the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Some people might think that refers to Judas, but that's not the case. It seems to me very clearly it's not the case. It's not saying that Judas has a greater sin than you, Pilate. It's Caiaphas. Caiaphas and the people outside who are bellowing for Jesus' crucifixion, who are baying for blood, who are continually trying to thwart Pilate in letting him go, are continually pushing for his death and crucifixion unrelentingly. Those are the people who have the greater guilt. That's what Jesus is saying here, it seems to be, and not unsurprising. They're the one who are initiating it and pushing it and forcing it through, as indeed they would, because better that one person die than for the entire nation. That also echoes here. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. Interesting that from then on he tried to set him free, because he's been trying to do that ever since the start. But there's renewed effort implied here. Why a renewed effort at this point? Because you have no power over me if we're not given to you from above. In other words, you're part of set in motion things which are entrained from the beginning of the world. But Pilate is seeking to release himself from that. He does not want to go down in history as the man who condemned the innocent Son of God. But the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." There's leverage here. You are meant to uphold Caesar's law. You're not doing so. You're undermining Caesar's position. What will Caesar make of it when they find out what you're doing? That's the implication here. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Here is a guy who claims to be the king of the Jews. How can you support that? That's the argument. It's quite a powerful one. Finally, it says here, when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat. And that's the final judgment. I'm getting rather fed up with this. This needs to have to be finished with on the stone pavement. It was the day of the preparation of Passover, about the 6th hour, early in the morning. The sun is up. Pilate seeks to let him go again. Here is your king, Pilate said. Take him. But it won't do. This must have been the 5th or 6th time now that Pilate has tried to let him go. But they shouted, take him away and crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Says Pilate. That's another attempt to try to let him go. Reason with you. Look, he's someone who represents you. You know, I can't crucify your king, someone who is important to you. It's a weak argument, and one that doesn't wash. We have no king, but Caesar, the chief priests answered. So after all of those attempts at trying to let Jesus go, time after time after time, it comes out, I find no basis of a charge. That's important. I found no basis of a charge. Throughout all of this, he's found no basis of a charge. What does that mean? That means that Jesus is innocent. This is an innocent victim. And Pilate is a weak person. Often we may find ourselves in a position doing things that we don't want to do. And if we do the things which we don't want to do, it makes us even weaker. Pilate is in this position. If Pilate had the strength and foresight to be able to do what he wanted to do, none of this would have taken place. But that was not possible because it was not foreordained in the sense of way that we have here. That we have no power over me, we're not given to you from above. There are forces acting here which are beyond even the scope of Pilate. But one thing Pilate does know above all else, and that is that he does not want the responsibility of the person who condemned Jesus Christ. As one very last act of desperation, in another gospel, it says he ordered a bowl of water to be brought in front of him. And he washed his hands in front of them all. A very theatrical act. A powerful act of, I am washing my hands of this whole business. This man's blood is not on my hands. I have washed it off. It's all down to you. That's the implication. Morally, he might be trying to do that. Technically and legally, he couldn't. Because he was the only one who had authority to crucify Jesus Christ. The chief priest didn't have that authority. So, if Jesus was crucified, it would have to be under the authority of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate would carry, therefore, that responsibility, whether he washed his hands or whether he didn't. It was a symbolic act, but it was a meaningless act. And it was a weak act, an act of a weak man. And that's what we see here in Pontius Pilate, a man caught up in powerful forces. One, on the one hand, where he desires strongly to give this man up free of charge and let him go because he recognizes something valuable and innocent within him, and the forces of the Jews and the Pharisees, and his fear of the emperor and of not being the role of playing the role that he should have done. What would the emperor do? He was threatened with not being a good Roman, not being true to his own kind. He was threatened too with the way in which he was not upholding the law. And he gave in. He gave up. He tried 6 or 7 times, 5 or 6 times, I don't know how many, but enough times to make it clear that he was having none of this. But in the end, he was forced to own it. He was forced to own the responsibility of being the man on whom the shoulders of responsibility is firmly placed for the death and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. His guilt, not as great as those of the chief priests and the Pharisees, who pushed it through by sheer force of power and personality, but they could only do so because of the weakness of the Judean governor, Pontius Pilate, who was not able to withstand that, and so forever is named as the weak one, who was unable to do what he knew was right, and gave up and gave in and gave up against his own conscience and his own abilities, and became the one person who allowed himself to be pushed and manipulated by others. Weakness and failure on the part of Pontius Pilate.